Okay, so today we're diving deep, you could say, into a world that honestly, I think a lot of us kind of take for granted, the world of forests.
Hmm.
And, I have to admit, when I first saw that we are going to be looking at a seventh grade science textbook, I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
But let me tell you, forests, our Lifeline, this book, really sucked me in.
It's amazing, isn't it, how much like genuine wonder is packed into these pages, you know? We
Yeah,
have this tendency to see forests as these like static backdrops kind of just there, but they are anything but static. They're these incredibly dynamic, vibrant ecosystems just bursting with activity, layer upon layer of life, all interconnected in these really fascinating ways.
right. It's like, when you're a kid and you think about what's under your bed, but instead of just like dust bunnies and lost toys, it's like a whole, I don't know, a whole ecosystem living under there.
Exactly. And this textbook does a really good job, I think, of breaking down those layers. Like starting at the top, you've got the canopy, and we've all seen, photos of those towering treetops, right? But they're not just impressive to look at, they're actually kind of calling the shots for everything that lives below them, controlling how much sunlight gets through, kind of like a giant green sunshade, you could say.
Fine.
And that, of course, has a huge impact on what can even survive in the understory. That's where you get all those shrubs and the smaller trees that are adapted to those, lower light conditions. And then you've got the forest floor.
Okay, see, now when I see the forest floor, I'm picturing like damp leaves, mushrooms, probably some weird bugs crawling around down there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like this whole hidden world of decomposition. You have all those fallen leaves, branches, even animal, droppings all getting broken down into this rich, really earthy smelling humus. And it's not just some random process either, right? There's this whole team of decomposers working on it constantly. Fungi, bacteria, all sorts of tiny invertebrates, all part of this like intricate web that ultimately recycles those nutrients back into the soil.
It really is wild to think about all that going on beneath our feet. Like I'm picturing those bioluminescent mushrooms,
Yeah.
the ones you always see in documentaries. Or that too cliche?
No, not at all. Forests are full of surprises.
Right.
Speaking of surprises, I'm curious what stood out to you about the way this textbook talked about the importance of forests. Like, what really resonated?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, obviously, we all kind of grow up knowing that trees are good for the environment.
Yeah.
They give us oxygen and all that good stuff. But I was really struck by just how much more they actually do. It's like they're these silent superheroes, just working behind the scenes.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah,
They really are the unsung heroes of our planet.
totally.
For example, let's talk about water for a second.
Okay, yeah, bring on the water.
Yeah, so we often hear about forests, like being compared to these giant sponges, right?
Yeah.
And this textbook, I thought, really brought that image to life.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm remembering that picture, the one with the raindrops, like, clinging to the leaves.
Yes, exactly.
It made the forest look so peaceful and still, even though it was probably like a total downpour happening.
Right. But that's the thing, forests are unbelievably good at catching and then absorbing all that rainfall. Their canopies and then all those layers of leaves and branches underneath, they basically act like this natural filter, really slowing down the water's momentum before it even hits the ground.
Which I guess is a good thing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, for one thing, it prevents all that soil from getting eroded away, and it helps prevent those, like, flash floods you sometimes hear about, but it goes way beyond that, actually.
Okay, now you got to tell me more. Come on.
Think about it this way. So instead of all that water just like rushing across the land, eroding the soil as it goes, causing these kind of destructive floods, it's slowly, slowly seeping into the ground. And what does that do? Well, it helps to replenish those groundwater reserves that we rely on. And it keeps the streams and the rivers flowing steadily all year round.
Wow, it really is mind-boggling, isn't it? How much we rely on these like totally intricate systems, without even realizing it, really.
Right.
And speaking of intricate systems, the textbook also touched on how forests can actually influence the climate. And I don't mean just globally by absorbing all that carbon dioxide, but like on a more local scale too, right?
Yes, precisely. It's not something that we always think about, but forests actually act as these natural air conditioners. So the shade that they provide, well, obviously that cools the air around them, but then through this process called transpiration, they actually release water vapor, which cools the surrounding environment even more.
So they basically create these little microclimates. I never even thought about it like that.
They do. And it's not just temperature either, Forests can even reduce noise pollution, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, creating these pockets of serenity in what's often a really loud and chaotic world.
Yeah, I was going to say, who needs those fancy noise-canceling headphones when you can just, hang out in a forest, right?
Right.
But on a more, well, I guess a more serious note, the textbook also talked about how forests are so intertwined with human lives, especially for, indigenous communities. And it's not just about the science, right? It's about a whole way of life.
Absolutely. And I think the textbook does a good job of pointing out that for countless generations, indigenous communities have lived in this real harmony with forests, relying on them for everything: food, medicine, shelter, even their cultural identity. It's all tied to the forest. And they hold this incredible wealth of traditional knowledge, particularly about all those medicinal plants that, many of us are just starting to rediscover.
Yeah, it's almost like as we've become more urbanized, we've kind of lost touch with that, that ancient connection. But speaking of losing touch, I guess that kind of brings us to the elephant in the room, which is deforestation. I mean, it's not just a bunch of trees being cut down, right? The consequences are huge, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the textbook actually does a good job, I think, of outlining that kind of ripple effect that deforestation has on every level, really. Like, one of the most immediate and devastating consequences is the loss of biodiversity, right?
Right, because it's like, I don't know, like tearing down an apartment building and not expecting the tenants to be affected.
Exactly, because every tree is home to countless species. I mean, you've got insects and birds and mammals, amphibians. When those trees disappear, so do all their habitats and all the food sources they provide. And that leads to, populations declining and in some cases even extinction.
Right.
And remember those intricate food chains that we were talking about earlier? Well, deforestation throws those totally out of whack. The predator that relied on a certain prey species, they might suddenly find themselves without, a meal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you end up with these huge imbalances in the entire ecosystem.
It's like this domino effect,
Huh.
But what about the impact on the climate, though? That's the big one, right?
Absolutely, because forests, they're these incredible carbon sinks, right? Meaning that they absorb these massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is what we need.
Yeah.
But when we cut down forests, not only are we removing those carbon-absorbing powerhouses, we're actually releasing all the carbon that was stored in those trees right back into the atmosphere. So it's like we're actually making the problem even worse.
It's almost like we're undoing like millions of years of natural balance or something. It feels kind of overwhelming when you think about it like that. But I mean, there's always a glimmer of hope, right? The textbook did mention something about forests being able to regenerate. So it does feel like we've been, kind of talking about a lot of doom and gloom and like scary stuff. So it's actually kind of reassuring to be reminded that, nature can be incredibly resilient.
Oh, absolutely.
Did the textbook give any specific examples of how forests like bounce back after something like deforestation?
It did. And it's funny because it's often those smallest things that play the biggest roles. Remember how we were talking about animals spreading seeds through their,
Yeah, let's just say it's not exactly the most glamorous side of nature, but hey, it gets the job done.
Exactly. And the textbook actually had this very vivid description, like I could really picture it, of a dung heap. Not exactly a pretty picture, right?
Right.
But there, sprouting right out of it, were these little seedlings. And I just thought, it's such a powerful image, right, of how life just finds a way.
It's true. It's actually kind of poetic when you think about it that way. From these, I don't know, like natural fertilizer packages, you get all this new life emerging.
Right.
I'm starting to see a theme here, I think.
Yeah.
It all comes back to that interconnectedness.
Exactly. From those tiny seeds, getting dispersed by animals all the way to those towering trees that create the canopy. Every single element in a forest plays a part in this really intricate dance of life and death and regeneration.
It makes you realize, doesn't it, that even like what we might think of as small actions, like cutting down even one single tree, can actually have these ripple effects throughout the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. And that brings us to that, I thought, really thought-provoking question that the textbook posed right at the end.
Okay.
What would happen if forests disappeared, completely? And it's not just some hypothetical question, it's something we should all be asking ourselves. How would our lives be different? What kind of a world are we, leaving for future generations?
It's true. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by it all, I think. Like, what can one person really do? Right.
Right.
But I guess it starts with awareness, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And just by, listening to this deep dive, you're already taking that first step. You're becoming more aware of the role that forests play, all the incredible things they do for us, and all the threats that they're facing. And from there, it's about making those conscious choices in our daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like supporting businesses that are, you know, operating sustainably, reducing how much paper we use, maybe even planting trees if you have the space for it, even
Right.
just, educating ourselves more about the forests that are, right in our local areas.
Totally.
All those little things add up.
It's like what we were saying earlier, right, about those ripple effects. But this time we're kind of creating those
Yeah.
positive ripples,
Exactly.
spreading that awareness, and hopefully inspiring some action.
Exactly. And, while the textbook we looked at today really focused on the science, which is, of course, crucial, there's also this really profound emotional connection that I think we all have with forests.
Yeah, for sure.
They inspire awe and wonder and this sense of peace. They kind of remind us that we're all part of something much, much larger than ourselves.
It's true.
Yeah.
Even just thinking about like how often you see forests used in stories and myths and fairy tales.
Right.
There's something magical about them that I think really does speak to us on a very deep level.
It does.
Yeah, well said.
So as a final thought for our listeners, I would just encourage you, go beyond the information that we've talked about today and go experience a forest for yourself.
Yeah, I love that.
Take a walk, breathe in that fresh air, listen to the sounds of nature, let that experience really inform your actions, inspire you to protect these incredible ecosystems that sustain us in, honestly, countless ways.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that, the profound impact of forests on our planet and in our own lives. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive for me, and I hope you found it just as fascinating. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.